morning. Welcome to the Portland Beer Podcast on Portland Culinary Radio. I'm Stephen Shomler, your host, here with Ken Wilson, the ultimate beer wingman.
I don't know how to respond to that.
You are the ultimate beer wingman because you drive and I drink. It doesn't get any better than that.
That's true. It's true. And I'm trying to think this morning how many miles I've actually put on my car and all the places we have been in my car.
That's right. In the Red October.
You can drink.
That's right. That's right. Ken drives me to drink in more ways than one, but he does keep me on the straight and narrow, so I'm grateful for that. So episode 1, I'm really excited. Our first guest is a true beer champion, Jeff Alworth. Good morning, Jeff.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Delighted. I'm delighted that you're here. So just for people, your bona fides, people that don't know who you are, which would be tragic if they didn't. I think that's awful. There might be somebody out there. You are the author of The Beer Bible, which is an amazing book. You are the author of Cider Made Simple. You are the creator and author of this cool kit we'll talk about later, the Beer Tasting Toolkit. Not everybody, I think, knows about that one, but I dig up everything on my guests, at least the good stuff. You've got a home brewer's book coming out next spring, Secrets of the Master Brewer. You are the founder of Brewvana, the blog, and you're the co-founder of Beervana Podcast. Have I missed anything?
Oh, that seems adequate.
I like that. That's a lot of stuff. Okay, so how the heck did you start as a beer writer? That's a question I want to have. But going back, just kind of curious about people's journey and how they got where they got. Where were you born?
Boise, Idaho.
Boise, and that where you grew up?
Yeah, until I was halfway through my sophomore year, and then we moved to Salt Lake City.
Okay, and then high school in Salt Lake City?
Finished high school there, yeah.
And then where from there?
And from there, I came here to Portland in 1986, which dates me, to go to Lewis and Clark College.
Wow, so is that where your beer journey started? Is here in Portland, going to college at Lewis and Clark?
Well, I'll confess that wasn't the first beer I'd had. I might have had some beer in high school, but not good beer, of course.
Not good beer. Okay, so was it drinking good beer then? Is that what happened here in Portland?
Yeah. I got here right when craft beer was being born. And so, the first, I think, craft beer I had here was probably at the McMenamins.
Which one?
The Raleigh, this is kind of a weird one. The Raleigh Hills was sort of my go-to, and then the Barley Mill also was kind of the two. But I had an older friend who worked at the Raleigh Hills, and so as a younger college student, I could walk in and nobody asked any questions.
Wow, that's cool.
Yeah.
Do you remember what your first kind of craft beer was?
I don't remember what the first one was, but I do know that my go-to and the beer that I really kind of galvanized me was Terminator Stout. And so it was kind of the opposite of Hams, which had formerly been my go-to.
That was one of the first craft beers I ever had, was a Terminator Stout at a McMenamins.
Yeah.
So not as cool at McMenamins as yours, but okay. So then you're quite the beer writer. I forgot to mention you also write for All About Beer, and you're a world traveler. These awesome breweries bring you in to kind of tell their story and check out what they do. So where did your beer writing journey start?
I got lucky when William Abernathy had been writing the MASH column for Willamette Week. He quit that job. I think he moved to San Francisco. Anyway, he quit that job, and it was open, and it had kind of an open casting call for it. And for whatever reason, I was a young guy, and they hired me to write that, and that's how I got my start.
So what year was that?
That's a good question. It was either 97 or 98. I'm not entirely sure.
All right. So you start out as writing a MASH column for the Willamette Week.
Yeah.
All right. And why did you want to write about beer?
Well, I liked beer, and the column came open. I had sort of hoped to do fiction and poetry before that, but that's a tough draw. I didn't want to do an MFA, and it's just tough. So I was happy to do any kind of writing. I love beer. Everybody loves beer, so writing about beer seemed like a good call.
And that was so a lot of people don't know your background as a political writer, and so that kind of fed into your wanting to write about beer. Am I correct about that?
I was just happy to write about anything, actually. And
You're a true writer.
Yeah, if there had been a column about politics that Willamette Week did and that guy had left, I'd probably try to have got that too. Who knows? I would have been interested in anything.
So I'm lucky enough to be friends with you on Facebook, and I read your political commentary you put on there, and it's always, like all of your writing, incredibly insightful and well thought out, and it's not divisive, at least in my opinion. It's just like analysis and insight. And a lot of people don't realize you started out writing as a political writer before you were a beer writer.
Yeah, I mean, the MASH did predate the politics a little bit. I was definitely interested in politics long before I was interested in beer. I remember when I was a small child, the Nixon impeachment. I couldn't understand what peaching the president was, but my family was really into that, and I got interested in that.
Ken is laughing.
Yeah, peaching the president. It didn't seem like a terrible thing to me, but and then the election of '76 I actually followed fairly closely, and I was 8 years old. So politics has always been a massive interest of mine.
So did you ever start a blog for?
My first blog was a politics blog. I didn't know they existed, and then I read about Talking Points memo in Paul Krugman's New York Times column, and within a month I'd started my own blog, and I started a politics blog, and then a few years later I was one of the 3 co-founders of Blue Oregon here in Portland.
And what year did you start your politics blog?
January of 2003.
Okay, and that's what I meant, because you had a politics blog before you had the Beervana blog.
That's true. That's definitely true.
So January 2003. So, and when did you learn about blogs?
December of 2002.
You got right on it now.
Yeah, I went on there and I found Blogger, and I was like, holy cow, you can actually just do this thing for free. And so I started it, and I was off to the races.
The phrase that comes to mind is like a duck on a June bug.
Yeah. I don't know what that means, but that's right.
It's like peaching the president.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that we should get Reverend Nats to do a special cider, or cider riot, or there's a lot of good cider makers here in Portland, in honor of you, peaching the president.
I do love me a good peach.
That's right. That would be fun. Or maybe we could do a beer at Culmination, peaching the president in honor of you. That would be fun.
Peach beers are really tasty.
I love peach beers. A lot of good fruit beer festivals coming up. So I'm very excited about that. All right, that's a tangent. So what's the difference between writing about politics and writing about beer?
They are kind of polar opposites. So the reason I started the Beervana blog was because in politics, it's zero sum. You have one candidate wins and one candidate loses, and there's no kumbaya in politics. It's just tough. So in the early blogging era, it was very there were a lot of anonymous stuff, so it was kind of a toxic environment. There was a lot of commenting and a lot of trolling, and I decided to start writing Beervana just because I needed an outlet for my political blogging. And, beer brings people together. It's kind of the opposite. People come to a pub because they want to share a pint and share some conviviality. And they don't want to get in bloody fights. It's sort of the opposite. It's more of healing. So that was interesting. And then I just naturally kind of shifted by the time the 2008 election ended. So did my most of my political writing. And I'd shifted over to beer more. And it felt healthier.
All right. And you probably had less trolls and haters.
Yeah. I mean, beer is a subject that inspires passion. So I've gotten in a few debates, but it's funny. Sometimes there will be a debate on online, and people will talk about how vicious things are getting, and I think, you don't know vicious. Like, go back to politics, and you'll see what a real troll is. Beer trolls are not real trolls.
Well, if you ever do start a blog with political commentary, I would be happy to read it and promote it, because I just find your stuff, your analysis, insightful, and I don't find it divisive. So, this is what's going on with this person to this person. This is how I see it, and I go, dang, I wish I'd thought of that. So. Yeah,
it is interesting. On Facebook, you have all your different friends. You have a diverse community, and I don't want to offend anyone. I just love to talk about politics. So it's different than writing about politics for a left-wing blog like I started out doing. So.
Oh, you could just write analysis and just write a blog pretending it's on Facebook.
Yeah, I could do that, and it would be interesting.
I would love it. I think it's great. All right. So, what year did you start Beervana?
2006 or 2007, I don't know. I'm really bad about these things.
Okay, all right. And then you continue to post articles there. That's Beervana, blogspot.com.
Right.
And you post and write articles all the time there. And then last year you started Beervana Podcast.
Right. Yeah, that was, I have a friend who is a economics professor at Oregon State University, and we met at Lewis and Clark and started drinking beer in Lewis and Clark together. So we've probably been homebrewing for 20 years together, and he had this idea, hey, we should have a podcast. You'll talk about beer, I'll talk about the politics or the economics of beer, and it'll be cool. And so we started it a year ago. Yeah,
you just had I listened to that. I'm one of your subscribers. Listen to that podcast.
Thank you.
You just had your 1-year anniversary.
Yep.
So great show. So if you are a beer drinker or beer fan, I would encourage you to read Beervana, a blog, and listen to Beervana, the podcast, because they're both very, very good, in my opinion.
Well, thank you.
I like them. All right, so let's talk about some of the cool content that you have cranked out. So I think everyone that is interested in beer should buy and read and study the Beer Bible. It really does feel like a Bible. I've got the hardback edition just because I own a lot of Bibles because I work in my previous life, and not like a previous life, but a previous career. And I just wanted it in hardback, and it's phenomenal. And you signed it and everything, which is so cool.
Very cool.
So talk for people that don't know. Kind of explain to them what the Beer Bible is.
Well, it's a book. It followed Workman Publishing's Wine Bible, and they decided they wanted to extend the franchise to beer. And so there was actually the beer tasting toolkit is sort of similar. It also followed the wine tasting something. It was the same kind of product. So I had my first two things that I wrote were based on wine products. But basically the idea is that it's a reference that has everything you'd ever want to know about beer, and it's organized roughly by style or type of beer, not necessarily style. Type is better than, we should say type more than style. And I tried to make it as interesting and as engaging as possible. I think references can often seem boring and something you wouldn't just be drawn in to read, so I try to focus it more on stories and use the power of narrative to make all that information interesting, and I hope I succeeded.
Yeah, it does not read like a textbook.
Good.
It is interesting. And part one, you've got Knowing Beer, which I really like. Tasting Beer Like a Brewer, page 58, which probably is some stuff that you borrowed from your first book you put out, the Beer Tasting Toolkit.
Yeah, the Tasting Beer Like a Brewer, and I know you've done this, if you've sat with a brewer, these guys have amazing palates, and they can taste a beer and identify ingredient and process from all the flavors that they have tasted. And if you've never sat with a brewer who can dissect a beer, it's an amazing thing. So.
Oh yeah, and you hear words you've never heard before. So it's got diacetyl.
Right.
It's over attenuated.
Right.
It just things like, I don't know what you just said, but wow, I'm impressed.
Exactly.
And then then you go into your types. You've got ales. For your types, you've got ales, wheat beers, lagers, tarts and wild ales. Mm-hmm. That's one section, part 5. And so those are kind of the big types that you chose to focus on in your book.
Yeah, the only contribution that the publisher had was they wanted those 4 categories as the categories to do this in. Everything else they left to me. So we did those 4 categories.
Would you change it all? Anything? Would you any kind of type you would add that works for you?
No, I mean those are decent ways to chunk it up. I think if I were to do it again, and I hope I do get to do it again, I would break it up by national origin, because the way people brew is probably more important than what they brew. Germans brew and think about beer very differently than Belgians or Americans or British brewers, and so Germans make both ales, wheat beer. They make ales, they make wheat beers, and they make lagers. They make them very similarly, and they make them in a German way. That's probably a bigger factor than the fact that they're a wheat beer, an ale, and a lager.
Okay. So that fast. Say that again. So it's more important about different people in different places brew in a different way.
Yeah, and this is actually the thing that I learned writing the book. I joke, but it's not actually a joke, that I wasn't qualified to write the book when I was hired to write the book. I only became qualified in the process of writing it. And one of the things I discovered was that national tradition is everything. And this now frames everything I think about beer, I think of in terms of national tradition. If you taste a beer, the way that beer is composed goes back to the circumstances of that style's origin, and they reflect things like local ingredients, technique is a huge thing, history, things like war, famine, tax law. All these things created the styles that we have now, and they go back, and you can trace them back to a particular town on the planet and tell the story of that beer, which is exactly what I tried to do in the book.
All right, so then I got 2 questions that come to mind. One is that at Culmination, we recently made a Vienna Lager. Mm-hmm. We called it Viva Vienna Lager because as we understood the history at Culmination, Vienna Lagers were made in Vienna and then kind of fell out of popularity until some people that moved to Mexico started brewing them there.
Right.
So we kind of Viva Vienna, we kind of had fun with, actually one of our fans picked the name. So do you have any idea, how do they brew beer in Mexico? Is that... You may not know because maybe you haven't traveled down there yet. Then we should have a Mexican brewer bring you down.
Right. I would like that.
Do you know about how they make beer in Mexico? Is it like they make it here or like they make it in Vienna? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean the thing is, styles go back to a certain place in time. Beers themselves, not always. So every country has its mass market breweries, and you've got Foster's, you've got Tecate, you've got Anheuser-Busch, Budweiser, you've got Carlsberg, where I was just at. All these breweries make beer based on other beers elsewhere, and the process of selling them to a mass market has a way of changing the way they're brewed and softening those edges and kind of disassociating them from their cultural context. That's really so that the beers that you have from the big breweries in Mexico are a lot like the beers we have from the big breweries in the United States. They have kind of become generic and dissociated from their original context.
Okay, so the next one concept I thought of when you talked about it matters where beer is made, because people in Germany brew beer differently than people here in America. So I really love Widmer's Hefeweizen.
Yeah.
I love that beer, but that's very different, I'm sure, than a German Hefeweizen.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So America is the other cool thing that I learned is America has invented its own national brewing tradition, and it's really the first one that has emerged in the world since 1842 when Joseph Kroll brewed the first Pilsner in Bohemia, in the Czech Republic, what's now the Czech Republic. If you go from one country to another country, the brewers in the first country will think the brewers in the second country are doing weird stuff that doesn't make any sense. And that's kind of those weird things that don't make any sense are the sort of the classic signs of the national brewing tradition. The United States now does weird stuff that the rest of the world doesn't understand, and one of them is the use of late edition hops. So we have this goes back to ingredients. So what do we have in the United States? We have these amazing, juicy, super intense hops. And they produce flavors that can't be muted. And in fact, when Willamette and Cascade were first grown and bred for the United States, they were bred for the big breweries to put in Coors and so on. Actually, Coors sponsored the growth of Cascade. Tried to put it in Coors and was like, we can't use these hops. They're way too crazy. They make our beer taste weird. So the United States started using these hops intentionally to produce more and more interesting flavors. And one of the things they learned is that if you put more and more of them in the later part of the brewing process, you get more and more juicy flavors. This thing, like right now, all these IPAs that we love have this really rich flavor. And when you hold the glass under your nose, it almost smells like a basket of fruit because it's so aromatic. This process of brewing to tweak this element of the hop has never been, nobody in the world has ever done that before. And if you go back to what the Widmers created with their flagship Hefeweizen, you find all the kind of the bones of that process. Like they were trying to make a rustic sort of, it didn't look like it was brewed in a large industrial brewery. It's cloudy, has this interesting visual aspect. Uses wheat, which is kind of rustic grain that wasn't really popular. There weren't really wheat beers being made in the United States. And then it had Cascade hops. And when you smell it, it smells like Cascade hops. It tastes like Cascade hops. It has nothing to do with the beers it was named after. It's an American pale ale that happens to be made with wheat. And I think it's one of the most characteristic early examples of American brewing we have. And it's funny that it's got that name, and probably if the Widmers could go back in time, they would choose a different name. I'm guessing, maybe not, but it's a slightly misleading name. But the beer itself is 100% pure America. Yeah,
I wrote in my book, Portland Beer Stories, I thought it was one of the most important beers brewed in America.
Yeah,
just because I've had so many people tell me it changed their beer drinking world. I know you recently wrote a Beervana article about that, about its importance.
They just had their 30th anniversary for that beer, so I used the occasion to write about that.
Yeah, that's awesome. All right, so Cider Made Simple. Talk to me about that book. I think we are at the epicenter of the cider world here in Portland. There's more cider made here, I think, than a lot of places in North America. I know we drink more cider here in Portland than they do in the entire region of New England.
Yeah.
But it's big across the country. So talk to us about your book, Cider Made Simple.
Chronicle Books came to me and asked if I would write a cider book, and they did it right after I turned in the manuscript for the Beer Bible, so the timing was perfect. And I had the opportunity to sit down and think about cider. It's a topic that people don't really know very much about, and think about if you're trying to explain to somebody what the world of cider looks like, what the flavor components are, where the different styles come from, different types. Basically, like if you walk into a pub and you see a cider that's being poured there, how do you interpret what that means? If it says it's a sweet cider, a dry cider, a Spanish cider, an English cider, a tannic cider, all these different kinds of words just kind of float out there in the ether, and what do they connect to? So the book that I wrote, I decided to choose a more narrative approach, so I kind of tell the stories, and I base it more on the countries of region. So I went to England, Normandy, and the Basque Country, and then I traveled to the part of southern south of Montreal. What is that place called? Why am I spacing? It's kind of early in the morning. I'm a little jet lagged.
That's all right.
Where they make ice cider, which is a fascinating thing, where you freeze the fruit and then you press it, and it produces this really thick, treacly juice, which you then ferment, and then tell the story from that perspective. And then the last chapter is all about American ciders and trying to interpret the different ways people make American ciders.
Yeah, because I hear American ciders, we do a lot of crazy different things.
Mm-hmm.
A phrase I've heard in my little bit of journey in the cider world, I recently met Tom Oliver from England. Wonderful guy, great guy. It was just such an honor to meet him. And he and people over in that part of the world, they make proper cider.
Right.
And Abram with Cider Rat, he always talks about proper cider.
Yeah.
Although I think some of his ciders aren't so proper, but they're very, very good.
Yeah.
So what's the difference between a proper cider and the other ciders?
Well, in England, so if you pick up a copy of Cider Made Simple, one of the two people I visited in England was Tom Oliver. So you can read about him and his farmhouse cider. In England, it basically distinguishes, it's kind of the people in America will immediately understand this, it distinguishes between the craft side of things, where you have orchard-based cider, you grow the fruit yourself, you press it, and you ferment it in your barn. Basically, most of these guys do it in their own barns, versus the stuff that's made in a factory, and it's composed of some apple juice, but mostly apple juice concentrate, sugar water, tannins, fake tannins, added tannins, added acids, added aromas, and then distilled into this kind of product that's perfectly 5.2 and has all the flavor components they want. It's completely consistent. I think they would not say that is not a proper cider. A proper cider is made in a farm. Tastes like apples.
Now, I did get to tease Tom and talk to him. I asked him whether or not Nat West, Reverend Nat, makes proper cider.
Yeah.
And he laughed and he said, no, but it's really good. He said, but it's weird stuff I could never make.
Yeah. The proper cider really comes from the English perspective. And so if Reverend Nat is so Tom makes apples, and the big cider makers make oranges, and Reverend Nat makes steak. I mean, it's like it's not even on the map.
It's a whole different thing completely. Yeah, scrumpy.
Yeah. I asked Tom what scrumpy was. That was he gave me an interesting answer, which you can read about in Cider Made Simple.
That's excellent. Okay, and then give us a brief little bit about Secrets of the Master Brewers coming out spring. We'll have you back on next year when that book comes out, just because I'm a big fan and love to get to chat with you. But give us a little foretaste of that.
It's a homebrew book, and it came out of my experiences writing the Beer Bible. I came back and was talking to homebrewers here in the United States and saying, in the Czech Republic, all their pilsners are decocted. It's actually, by law, České pivo must be decocted. And they all use first...
Decocted?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
That sounds like a naughty thing that I would have said in high school.
Yeah, sorry.
So tell us what the heck that is.
It's an old-timey process of mashing, which is the first stage where you extract the sugars from the malt. And the process predates the thermometer. And
Okay,
it was designed in this old-fashioned way to extract the sugars from the malt before you actually knew what temperature the water was that was doing that.
So mashing, tell me if this is correct, you put your malt into a big tank, into a vessel,
Yep.
and then you run hot water over it, and you basically then that makes kind of like a barley tea.
Exactly.
And then that barley tea is then what you then use as a base to make beer.
Right.
We call it sweet wort, and then as soon as you boil it and add hops, it becomes beer.
Right.
So that's the mashing process. So this decocted thing, what the heck?
It's this really convoluted way where you take, you do exactly what you said, but you start out with kind of cold water. You just get it wet. And then after a period of time, you take a part of that, the liquid and the solid mash, so the grain and water, and you put it in a separate vessel and boil it actually bring it up. You raise the temperature a bit, and then you boil it. And when you return that portion back to the main mash, it's at boiling temperature, so it's about a third of the volume. It will raise the temperature of the entire mash up to the next, what we say, step in brewing. And then you can do that 2 or 3 more times, depending on your process. So it's very long and
And these people are required to do this?
If you want to call your beer České pivo, Czech Pils, you have to use decoction. So it's by law, you can still make beer that's not decocted, but you can't call it České pivo. You can't call it beer. You have to call it something else. So this is this is one of those national tradition things I'm talking about.
It matters where it's made.
Yeah, it matters where it's made. So I was telling homebrewers this, and they were really fascinated. And it's true with every country that I visited. I learned things from brewers there that was super bizarre and weird, and we don't not like Americans brew. So I was telling homebrewers that, and they were always fascinated. And then it occurred to me, I should write a homebrew book where I go back to those brewers and I have them compose a 5-gallon batch of beer, and we talk about their process and sort of translate it so you can make a batch of beer. If you want to make an English bitter or a Czech Pilsner, I go back to a brewer and we talk through that process and how you do it if you did it in the Czech or the English way.
So if I'm a home brewer, I pick up the book and I learn from these people that you've learned their different secrets.
Exactly, because and I'm not a great I am a home brewer. I've been home brewing for a long time. I'm kind of a terrible home brewer, but those guys are pretty good brewers. So I think they can. I'm just kind of the midwife. I take their wisdom and I put it on the page.
I will be tempted, although this might be a bad idea, to buy a copybook for Rodney and have him review your book for us. So
yeah, Rodney, he's the wrong guy. He knows everything already. This is not for him. This is for the hackers like me who don't know.
But he would probably have some good helpful insight. I'm a fan of Rodney, so I think he's a good guy.
This is Rodney Kibsey, who's one of the best brewers in the nation and wins tons of awards. And he talks to commercial and professional brewers all the time, and he's already learned their tricks. So he's a smart guy.
Yeah, but he can say yes. He'll probably say yes. Jeff's book is amazing.
Nah, I don't know about that.
All right. So, and I did cover. If you want to read not a humble brag at all, but if you want to read Rodney's story, you can pick up my book, Portland Beer Stories, and I tell the story of Rodney.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, good.
All right, so I have just opened, for the first time in my life, the Beer Tasting Toolkit by Jeff Alworth. I ordered it off of Amazon and got it. It came in a really cool box. I open it up, and what the heck is this stuff? What is the Beer Tasting Toolkit?
Yeah.
Oh, there's an actual little booklet in here, too.
And the actual little booklet is the thing they paid me to write. And everything else, Chronicle Books put together. It's a little kit that allows you to do blind tasting at home, and it seems a little bit gimmicky, but the truth is, and probably it is actually a little bit gimmicky, but the truth is, blind tasting is one of the most important things anybody who wants to appreciate beer can do. And if you have never done blind tasting, it's really worth sitting down and concealing the beer that you think you know so well and tasting it with other beers and seeing how well you actually do know it when you don't have the label and the knowledge of the style and all those things that we take for granted when we go into a beer, tasting a beer. You become humble immediately. You realize how much of the thing you think you know about beer comes from these extraneous elements, not what comes through your mouth and your nose.
So you've got cool little bags. I've got bags in here. Is that to put the bottles in?
Exactly.
Or the glasses, I suppose.
No, the bottles, and yeah. So the idea is, and they're numbered. So you put say you're tasting IPAs, you put your different IPAs in there, and then when you pour them out, you can keep them straight because they're numbered. That's the idea behind that.
That's awesome. And then you've got a tasting notebook here. So this is for each beer that I taste.
Yep.
Take my notes.
And you'll know here, we can bring in a little bit more local color. There's at the bottom of the tasting notes, there's the beer flavor wheel, okay. And it's basically stolen. I changed some of those things that I think are a little bit. It's stolen from Dave Selden, whose 33 Beers has kind of revolutionized tasting notes. But I changed. I didn't steal it directly. Only the idea. I did change that little thing a bit.
Yeah, he does 33 Beers. Those little booklets.
Yeah.
He does beers. He does ciders. He has one for ciders. I think he does one. Does he do one for donuts? I think or.
He does it for basically everything, so probably donuts.
I love what he does. Yeah.
Name a thing that you can consume, and he probably has a book that has.
And he's got a cool cider mug too. Have you seen that?
Yeah, I have one of those. It's nice.
Yeah, that's really nice.
Yeah, he's a cider guy. The cool thing about getting into the cider world is it's a much smaller world, and kind of like have secret handshakes and stuff. He's a cider guy.
Yeah, you learn that the thing that has pear in it that a normal person would call a pear cider. No, it's a Perry.
It's a Perry.
Yeah, which makes me want to ask for it in a sippy cup. I just think Perry is a strange name for a pear cider, but it means it has no apple.
And it's spelled Perry, not Peary.
Yes.
It's an important thing to know about.
Yeah, maybe they were just fans of the Daily Planet and Perry White. I don't know.
Yeah.
All right, that's just a little insider comic book reference. So, so your little handbook that comes out with it, beer tasting toolkit. You've got different descriptions of beers.
Right, and it's very simple. They're super tiny, and it's just designed for you to, if you're tasting stouts, or porters, or saisons, or whatever it is, you could read about what those styles are supposed to taste like. And I think I haven't looked it up in a while. This came out in 2012, so I don't know what to talk about. Do I talk about national brewing tradition in those 42 words I have?
So someone that's...
Yeah, a little bit, I do.
So Rodney, we mentioned Rodney. This wouldn't be something for him. But someone checking out new to the craft beer community, this would be a perfect book for them.
I think so, yeah.
This would be a perfect toolkit. Yeah, I was out at Teutonic Wine yesterday, working on my next book, and they are great people out there. And he said something, finally encapsulated what I felt and experienced in the wine world. You have to be an expert to enjoy wine. They expect that. They look down on it if you're not. Whereas beer, we make beer really accessible. And if someone is joining the beer community, I think they should pick up this toolkit. I think they should get it.
Yeah, that's a really, I think, important point. And I start the Beer Bible out by saying, people always ask me, what's the best beer? What's your favorite beer? And I say, actually, the best question is, what's your favorite beer? Because that's really the place to start. Beer is totally accessible. It is a thing that we can all appreciate. And the flavors are really distinctive. A stout does not taste like a Pilsner. They look different. They taste different. It's not like the difference between a Pinot and a Shiraz or something like that. I don't even know what I'm talking about. But are those two red ones? I hope I got those right.
Oh, man.
Or Merlot. That's red. You don't have to have special inside knowledge to be able to taste the difference between a porter and a Pilsner. And you should just start there. And if you like porters, you don't have to drink Pilsners if you don't like Pilsners. Just drink porters. And
speaking of making beer accessible, I just want to emphasize, if someone's a beer fan, they need to buy and pick up and read the Beer Bible, because the book is big, it's thick if you get it in hardback, and you're like, oh man, but it's eminently accessible. There's short sections, short titles. I think it's just perfect. So
cool.
I can't say that enough. What a big fan I am of that book.
It's going to end up being my great work. So I'll have to agree with you there.
Excellent. All right. So you mentioned good beer. So what makes for a good beer?
I think this is we're in the world of subjectivity here now, of course, and people will define it differently.
Beer according to Jeff. Good beer according to Jeff.
I think good beer is beer that is composed well and has balance, and it's the kind of thing that if you have 10 people in a room and you gave 10 people this beer and they all thought, yeah, that's pretty good beer, it's a pretty good beer. I mean, the things that make a good beer are not, it's not like good art where you can stand in front of art and if you don't know art, you have no idea how to evaluate it. Good beer is accessible, so it should taste good. I mean, it's just kind of a basic thing. It's the Judge Potters. I know it when I see it. And one reason why many people have disparaged mass market lager is because it tastes okay. It's nice and consistent and stuff, but it doesn't have a lot of flavor. It's sort of like cake you'd make from a mix versus cake your grandma made from her secret recipe, that was made with a bunch of wonderful ingredients. They're just really different products, and one tastes good. So I think you can overthink this, and I could go on and on and on about the flavor constituents and national tradition and talk about what a good beer is from kind of a technical or artistic approach, but I think sometimes that misses the most basic approach, which is, does the beer taste good? We're sitting here in a brewery, and I think if people came in here, we could start handing them beers, and they would know if it's good.
Well, and does it taste good to you?
Right.
Yeah, one of my obstacles initially to the craft beer, for lack of a better word, craft beer world was bitter, hoppy beers.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't stand it. I didn't like it. And Ken and I went down to Willamette Valley Hops 2 years ago. We filmed there. He made an amazing video about it. It's just fantastic. And I got to see the hops on the vines. I got to hold them in my hand. They're like a bunch of flowers. I got to go into the drying room, and they smelled. We are recording in a live working brewery.
There
this stuff happens. We got to. I got to smell them in the drying room. They smelled different every time, and it was an amazing experience. And then we got back, and we went back to the office, and the gentleman said, "Oh, here, I'll give you this. This is a triple IPA, not a Belgian Tripel, but a triple IPA." And I'm like, "Oh crap, I hate those beers. I don't want it." And he cracked the can, and as he was bringing it toward me, I could smell the aromas and hit me. Those are those flowers, and thank goodness it was a very hoppy IPA that was not bitter.
Right.
And so I think that's where flavor comes in. If you can get an IPA, like I love Gigantics IPAs. Some of them are very hoppy, but not bitter.
Right. Yeah. That's a really important key. Hops contribute flavor, aroma, and bitterness, and it can be hoppy without being bitter. It can be bitter without being aromatic.
Hoppy. Yeah, aromatic. There you go. So a good beer to you is, does it taste good, and does it taste good to you?
I think that's right. And, of course, if you experiment with more beers and you get drawn into it, and if you read about the history of beer, and if you travel to a place, I didn't think I loved Helles beer is this kind of beer they make in Bavaria, and I thought, it's a really boring style. I'm not into it. It's going to suck when I have to travel around Bavaria, and I'm going to be drinking all these Helleses. Helles is now one of my favorite beers because I talked to brewers, I learned the history of it, and I sat there and I drank, 20 liters over the course of the time I was there in different places.
Yeah, that was just 3 days.
Yeah, that was actually the first night. It was. You can drink a couple of liters in a pub there, and without thinking about it, and without getting drunk. And anyway, once you do that, you get drawn into it. You kind of understand the perspective of the beer from its own side, and you can start appreciating it. So. Your what is a good beer will change if you continue to drink beer and experiment with other beers, for sure.
Yeah, I discovered I like fruit beers, I like coffee beers, I like stouts, I like dark beers. I like a really hoppy, non-bitter IPA, which I never thought I would have said 5 years ago.
Right.
And those are all kind of, exactly right. Every time I try a new style or type, kind of expands. I go, I like this one too. So what are some of your personal favorite styles or types? Or like you just like them all?
I do like writing the Beer Bible had this interesting effect of making me appreciate beers that I wouldn't have said I liked so much, like Helles's I just mentioned. There were others too, and I kind of erased all of that. In fact, I even sort of have grown to appreciate mass market lagers. I think the way you can tell which beers you like is when you walk into a pub. And you see all the different styles up there. Do you find yourself continuing to order a few of the same styles? And I definitely do. There's ones that I go to. So Saison is one of my big faves. I like a nice Pilsner at Helles. I do like American IPAs a lot. They vary so much that it's always a bit of a crapshoot. Like you, I tend to like ones that are more flavorful and aromatic and less bitter, although I like a little bit of bitterness. I love dark ales. Back to my Terminator Stout. They have kind of fallen out of favor here in the United States, and that I suffer that when I walk into a place, especially in the winter. I like a nice stout or a porter when I walk into a pub, and often there's not one available. What else? Oh, English cask ale, which is kind of hard to get in the United States, but if I could go to one place and if you could teleport me to one place for a beer, I would almost always go for an English pub, a nice 4% cask ale, cask bitter. So we
are lucky that here in Portland, more breweries in the city of Portland than any other city in the world.
Oh, and I can't believe I forgot this. Hold that thought.
Okay.
Goose Lambic, the classic.
Say that again.
It's either goose or goose, and it's kind of depends on who's saying it. But it's the one. It's Lambic, the 3-year-old, 2-year-old, and 1-year-old Lambic that's blended together, and it's produced. It's Gueuze. Or I think there might be another E in there. Anyway, it's pronounced goose or goose, and it's maybe the most accomplished beer in the world.
Where the heck do they make this beer?
They make it in around Brussels, and it's made by just a few producers. So it's kind of hard to find. You can get a product here in the United States called Mariage Parfait from a brewery called Boone, which is actually pronounced Bone, but it's spelled Boone. That's a good example of it. But anyway, that's
Okay.
I would die if I couldn't ever have another one of those beers.
All right, we'll have to send you on a trip there to go have some.
Yeah, they're really good beers.
So you're lucky here in Portland, at least, because you probably get a lot of it like Saisons. We've got the Commons right here.
Yeah.
I mean, Commons just, I love their beers. I like the Hop on the Pool Helles from Base Camp. So you get a lot of different, you can have a lot of different styles of beer right here in Portland.
That's right.
Very different kinds. What was it the first, what did Brian Yeager tell me? One of the first beers that Widmer tried to make was an alt beer, and it didn't work for them back then. It was just too hoppy.
Right.
And now, years later, Occidental makes a great alt beer that sells really, really well.
Yeah.
So talk to me now just about the big picture. You get to a lot of beers you like other places. We kind of make them here, make lots of different styles of beer here. What do you think about the Portland beer scene? Big picture. Or the Oregon beer scene, either way. We have a lot of breweries in Oregon as well.
Right. I think I'm gonna use the word Portland here, but you can substitute in your mind Oregon because I think it applies equally well to the rest of the state. Having traveled around the world, not around the world, but around Europe for the Beer Bible, I got to go to some of the great beer cities in the world. And, London, Prague, Munich, Dusseldorf and Cologne, Brussels. And I always assumed that beer culture there would be the best in the world and that the United States would take decades or centuries to catch up to. And my experience is actually that there are cities in the United States that are definitely already caught up. None is better than Portland. I would say that Portland is one of the best beer drinking cities in the world, probably the best. And part of that has to do with one thing I learned when I was traveling around is you can look at different. If you want proxies for a good beer city, you should look and see, do they grow hops here? Do they grow malt here? Do they have, is this a place where beer styles came from, like Cologne has Kolsch? Do they have brewing schools? All these kind of things that sort of are indicators of really good beer town or state. And we have all that stuff. We also have the USDA hops research thing down in Corvallis. We have brewing schools. We have a yeast lab at Y Yeast. We actually have 2 with Imperial now.
Yep.
We have this amazing water. Like everything about Portland is we grow our own hops here. Has all those kind of classic hallmarks that you find in Munich. Like Munich is probably the greatest beer drinking and brewing city in the world. And I wouldn't say that it would be a little bit too arrogant and American to say that Portland's better than Munich, but Portland's pretty darn good. And you can find a decent Helles here in Portland, but you will not find a decent IPA in Munich. So there you go.
And part of that is just because they make beer in Munich the way they make beer in Munich, and
Exactly.
it doesn't fit with, whereas here we're willing to adapt all kinds of different ways of making beer.
Yeah, and I think, everybody thinks of the Northwest and the West Coast as being IPA country, but as you pointed out, we're now seeing the development of smaller breweries that focus in on a particular kind of beer style that does not make IPA. So, we have places like the Commons, Occidental, and Upright. These guys have never made IPAs, or I think Alex Ganoom at Upright made one IPA, an English-style IPA once or something, but they don't make IPAs, and that would be surprising to people. We have farmhouse breweries, we have sour breweries like Cascade, we have
Beer Guard.
Yep. So we have we have all the world's kind of different regions right here in Portland, and I think that will be typical in other cities in America going forward. But we've had it first, and I think it's really well established here.
All right, so what do you see for the next 5 years? Any thoughts what might happen, Portland beer scene? Because you've grown up in the Portland. You moved here in '86.
Yep.
Moved here in '86, and you've kind of been from the beginning, and you've been writing about beer since '96 or '97. We're not sure which.
Right.
And you've been drinking beer that long, been home brewing, so you have a long perspective, local perspective. A lot of people don't have.
Yeah.
So your best guess, next 5 years.
I think Portland is always going to be a beer town, and I don't know how much. I was in Tampa flogging my beer book last year, and Tampa surprised me at how great the beer scene was there. I don't know if it's going to stay a great beer scene. I think Portland is always going to be a brewing town. I mean, it's been a brewing town almost since it was founded. We had Henry Weinhardt's right downtown. I think that's a really interesting marker of good beer towns in the United States. We have beer in our blood here. So I don't expect that it is a fad. I think if you came back to Portland in 50 years, you're going to find a lot of breweries here and a lot of people making good beer. the shorter horizon is a little bit hard to tell. I do think that in terms of beer development, we're going to see more and more diversification. The way that we have we have German breweries, saison breweries, sour breweries, all these things.
Rosenstadt.
Yeah, exactly. So
or
Zeugelhaus, right? So you're seeing a diversification in the market, and I think that's great. I think that will continue to happen. These breweries will make 1,000 barrels of beer, or maybe 2,000 barrels of beer, and they can survive on that. That's the size they want to be, and the market is maybe like 2,000 barrels of beer. It's a great farmhouse market. Probably not. You can't get as big as Widmer making farmhouse sales, but that's fine because people love the Commons. It's always full of people. They love that beer. I love that beer. I think Urban Farmhouse is one of the best beers in Oregon.
I like Bourbon Little Brother and Myrtle. Those are two of my favorites.
Everybody has different favorites, which goes to show how good they are.
That's right, exactly.
So I think that will continue. I think that in terms of IPAs, people often say, what's the next IPA? I think we're coming to a terminal point. I think America, and it's not just Portland, is finding its voice in terms of IPAs. And I think they will be this very fruity, very aromatic kind of IPA that we're starting to see now. And I'm guessing that the strength will drop a little bit. I'm guessing that IPA is around 6%. Like in 10 years, I bet the 6% super juicy IPA is still around, and it's kind of the thing. I think really bitter 7.5% IPAs are phasing out.
Okay, interesting. All right, so last question. That's kind of controversial, but how do you define craft beer? What is craft beer? What is this thing that we're a part of?
Yeah, I think the word craft beer leads into a thicket that I don't really want to go into so much. Having traveled around and seen big brewers, like when I went to Anheuser-Busch, was the last brewery I toured for writing the beer Bible. Those people at Anheuser-Busch are so proud of the beer they make. They think it's the best beer in the world, and they quite rightly point to how much beer they make and how much they sell, and they say that's a pretty good, wouldn't you like to make 50 million barrels of this beer? Like, that's not a terrible way to measure how good our beer is, right? And it struck me that that's kind of true, like we're seeing craft breweries grow and grow and grow, and one of the ways we judge whether they're good, the New Belgiums, the Sierra Nevadas, is that they sell a lot. So it's weird that all of a sudden we would hold that against the big breweries, but not the little breweries. There's that whole thing. I think as consumers, what we want is the availability of a really good beer. We talked about what good beer is. That's the thing you like to drink.
Right.
We want that around. We want a diversity of beer. So we talked about this culture here in Portland that has all the different kinds of breweries making different kinds of beers. And you want it to be available here locally. You want to be able to buy local breweries. You want these little local breweries to survive. And so what I've been saying is drink local, drink good, and drink on draft. I think these are the three things. If you want to encourage that beer culture that really supports diversity and quality in the local market, you want to drink local. So that doesn't mean that you should not drink Bone Mariage Parfait, but it means that you should go down and support your local brewery. The thing that keeps them in business is if you're sitting down in front of the bar drinking their beer. And if you go to any of these other great beer cities, Munich, London, Brussels, Prague, you find people sitting in the bars everywhere. Bar culture is really big. Pub culture is really big. It's what supports and sustains local culture, local beer. You want to drink good because you want to be discerning, and you want to create the way markets work is breweries sell what people are buying. So if the market is not discerning and they're buying whatever, then brewers will make whatever. But if you're buying that stuff that tastes good, people will try to brew stuff that's good and flavorful and wholesome.
So I had a story recently. It was a warm day here, and I was at walking through Fred Meyer, and this guy grabbed this 12-pack of what I would consider awful, horrible, terrible beer. It's kind of stuff my dad would have drank when I was growing up. Kind of reminds me of cold horse piss. And he and I made eye contact, and I must have had a horrified look at my face. He goes, "Oh, I know it's awful beer, but it's it's cheap and it's cold."
Right.
And I said, "Unfortunately, it's also foreign owned."
Yeah.
I said, "Why don't you buy that one and drink some American beer that's American owned?" And he hung his head in shame and walked away.
Yeah, you want to support your local business, right?
So two things in my head. One is that I don't think that guy really knew what good beer was. I don't think he just kind of drank the can of the stuff.
Right.
And I bet if that guy went to 3 different Portland breweries, I don't care which ones, and started drinking some beers, he discovered, wow, there's a whole world out there of what I thought this was good beer, and I can still drink that, the cold horse piss. But now these things are amazing. So one thing thing. I think an educated consumer discovers, oh, there really is a lot of good beer.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that matters to me, at least, is local is locally made. And locally owned, or at least I would prefer to drink beer from a company at least American owned.
Yeah,
just that's kind of how my bent goes.
Yeah, and I think that's the reason I came up with this kind of three-way thing is because if you are drinking breweries that make beer locally, whoever they're owned by, eventually you're going to support local beer. You don't have to think so much about ownership structures. If you're drinking at Widmer, and then you go downtown and you drink it at 10 Barrel, and then maybe you walk over to Deschutes and you drink it at Deschutes, yeah, you're supporting AB. They own 10 Barrel now. But the truth is, over time...
And that's not American owned. That's
it's not American. Yeah, that's right.
Foreign owned.
They're owned by a giant conglomerate that's sort of a Brussels, Sao Paulo, or Brazil, I think Sao Paulo-based multinational. But the truth is, if you don't think very hard about that, you will keep that little pub at 10 Barrel in business because you're patronizing it, and that money will go to Anheuser-Busch. But their Pints is right around the corner there too. Maybe you'll also go to Pints. You'll keep all these other businesses in all these other breweries in business too, and that's really the key. Keep your local brewery in business, and if it's owned by a multinational, it's not the end of the world. But make sure that your local breweries stay in business. That's really the key, and then you don't have to think about it too much, because I do think that's kind of inside baseball, and it's really hard for consumers to keep track of who owns what brewery and what percentage, and is it private equity or another brewery. All that stuff kind of takes the joy out of it. If there's a brewery there and the brewer, this is the thing about 10 Barrel. We know the brewers, we know, we see them around town. We see the brewery. It's right there. So I would say focus less on that and focus more on where the beer's made and drink locally.
Fair enough. All right, and then your third one was drink on draft.
Yeah, drink on draft. And this is the way that beer culture develops is there's a communication that happens between the brewer and the customer. And the way the brewer learns is by talking to customers. So you go in your pub, you talk to the barman, or if you're at a brew pub, you might be talking to the brewer, but that'll go pretty directly back to the brewery. They learn how to cater to your preferences. And what you find is, if Cologne and Dusseldorf have these two beer styles. Alt beer is brewed in Dusseldorf, and Kolsch is brewed in Cologne. And Alt is not in Cologne, and Kolsch is not in Dusseldorf. And they're a half an hour apart up, down the Rhine. So how did this happen? It's the most bizarre thing. It's they have a total free market, and they only make one beer style, and that beer style is only available in that city. Well, it's because this is the beer that there was this communication, decades-long communication that happened between brewers and drinkers, and they came to agree that this was the best beer style in that region and that time, and that's how that developed. So if you want distinctive, you want to be drinking in pubs and let the breweries know what you like, and then they'll respond to that.
That works. That's good. Okay, so you're not as worried about craft. That's not you said it's a thicket you don't get into, but your advice would be for people to drink local beer, drink good beer, and drink beer on draft.
Yeah, and I think craft will take care of itself. I think you will, if you do all those three things. Your local brewery that's owned by the local brewer, he will stay in business, or she will stay in business, and it'll take care of itself. Portland right now drinks so much beer that is brewed here, and if we continue to subscribe to this philosophy, we will continue to support these same local breweries, and it will always be here for us.
So 2 observations to have about craft that we mentioned. You don't need to comment on these, but Stone is now brewing. Stone's craft beer. I mean, people think of Stone, and I love Stone. It's amazing. But they now are an international brewer.
Right. They have a new brewery in Berlin.
And so you could go to Berlin and drink local, drink good, and drink on draft, and you'd be drinking Stone in Berlin.
Right.
How crazy is that? Who would have ever thought that years ago?
That's right, and that will and Stone knows this. That will change the palate in Berlin, and it's interesting. I think it's going to be a really interesting thing. Either Berlin will accept Stone, Berlin will, or Stone will change to meet the Berliners' palate, or something else will happen. So it's
something's going to give.
Yeah, something's going to give. So it'll be interesting.
And then and then my bent, one of my issues, I know, and it's inside baseball, I know, but I'm not excited about beer owned by a Costa Rican pineapple conglomerate. Not my thing.
Right.
And I know it's way inside baseball, and I would have never known that stuff years ago, but I've learned it. So to me, ownership matters. So you just got back from Carlsberg,
right?
And they are
independently owned.
and have been for a long time.
Yeah, so they are independently owned. They're multinational, and Stone is independently owned and multinational. So which one is craft?
There you go. I think that's a great way for us to end. So, Jeff, thank you so much. I'm just honored that you're our first guest here on the Portland Beer Podcast.
Well, I'm honored. Thank you for having me.
I love all that you do for the Portland beer community and to educate Portland beer fans like myself. And we will encourage people to listen to your podcast and buy your books and read your blog, and just please keep doing what you're doing. We're very grateful.
Well, thank you for having me, and I hope your new venture is a great success.
We'll have fun. We'll just tell beer stories. That's what we'll do. All right.
Yeah.
I think now we should have a beer. What do you think?
How can you go wrong with that? Yeah. Let's do it. It's almost 9:30, so it's time for a beer.
That's right. Exactly. It's 12 o'clock somewhere.
Yeah. Well, I'm still kind of on Copenhagen time, so it is really time for a beer.
Perfect. All right. You got it all, Ken? We good?
We're good.
All right. You're going to have to drive me now to have some beer, I think.
You're in a brewery. I don't understand why we have to drive you anywhere.
All right.
And how do I get a wingman? So that's what I want. I need my own wingman to drive me around.
There you go.
I should hire myself out. I should do that.
All right. Stephen Shomler, along with Ken Wilson, you've been listening to the Portland Beer Podcast on Portland Culinary Radio. Cheers.